what has happened last week, and we didn't have that much of coverage, that much of talks about what has happened in India between Russian president and Modi. When you look at the visit of Vladimir Putin to India and the meeting he had with Modi, what were the most important objectives of this meeting or this visit, and how important was that?
Good question. And it's very important, your first point, Nima. Why has the Western press, particularly the US media, and why have the podcast media failed to cover something as significant to Russia as well as to India and to China as this? Why have they ignored it? Why is our coverage, our media coverage, the focus that we give our audience so centered on Washington and Trump? In this particular case, it's very important to understand how off-center our media are, and therefore how confused our audience must be. From the Russian point of view, President Putin demonstrated physically, socially, a level of comfort, a level of relaxation, a level of mental ease, let's say, with the Indian side, not simply with Prime Minister Narendra Modi, but also with the journalists he met in the Kremlin a couple of days before he left, a level of relaxation as he discussed the multipolar world in which India, China, and Russia are the large nuclear powers. Each of them have significant war-fighting problems with President Trump. And the level of relaxation, the level of articulation that Putin gave to the Indians is quite unusual. Second, from the Russian point of view, the objective was to demonstrate commitment to the strategic partnership on all fronts with the Indians. And that means military-industrial complex relations. There's a particular negotiation now for the supply of Sukhoi 57 jet aircraft. There's a bid from the French. There has been a bid from the Americans to compete, but the French are in better position than the Americans in the competition. But it's very important for the Russian side to demonstrate the capabilities of the aircraft and of the S-500 air defense system, which is also up for negotiation. But there are also far more areas of military technology, missile development. The Indian BrahMos is a joint venture with Mashinostroyenia, the Russian and Soviet missile plant, and there's continuing development there for the defense of India, as well as the testing of Russian capabilities to defend its allies and defend itself. There's obviously a nuclear partnership, both on nuclear power and control of nuclear weapons. There's a great interest on the Russian side to develop a range of businesses. And we can get back to what isn't yet clear on the Russian side for investment in India, because Russian investment in India is extremely small and has to change to build a foundation for that strategic partnership. On the Indian side, a very important thing that people outside India don't understand. India is a rising, not just a regional power, a global power. And India, as President Putin himself said to the Indians in the India Today television interview before he left, India is no longer a colony of an empire, no longer. And that message is profoundly popular in India. India wants respect for its independence, its sovereignty. At the same time, it needs to defend itself on several war fronts. It recently fought a war, as we've discussed, with Pakistan. Pakistan has reoriented the United States, and we're back where we used to be, with the United States assisting the Pakistan military in posing significant threats to India, towards the Pakistan east, Iran towards the Pakistan's west, and Afghanistan, and so on. We've talked about that. We can come back to it. But from an Indian point of view, the objective is to establish India's standing as a major global power, so that the Troika, or as it's called in India, the RIC, Russia, India, and China, is to be understood as a dominant, growing alliance. Now, both Prime Minister Modi and President Putin repeated, we are not allies against anyone. That's a theory, okay? In theory and in principle, that's true. However, there's no doubt that from an Indian and Russian point of view, Trump poses all sorts of military threats, economic warfare threats. These threats are in the form of sanctions. They've had particular application to the trade in oil between Russia and India, but the conduct of economic warfare between the two countries is a Trump innovation, is a Trump threat. And then, of course, there's the relationship with China. Now, China took several days, only yesterday, to make an announcement of its attitude to and an appreciation for the summit. And we can read that out because it was rare. It was also, let's call it an understatement, because there is mutual suspicion on the Indian side, on the Chinese side. Which way will Russia tilt militarily, diplomatically, if there's another border conflict in the Himalayas, as there has been in the past, between India and China? Now, India and China both have the new opportunity to mend fences, make new forms of direct military, defensive, economic relationship. China is a major trading partner with India, much more important in trade for India than Russia is, much more diversified in long term. So what Trump is doing in the region is, in fact, encouraging China and India to make new kinds of relationships. And let me just read you one little line that the Chinese spokesman, foreign ministry spokesman, whose name is Guo Jiakun, who said yesterday in his statement, when asked by the Indian reporters in Beijing, how does China assess this summit? He said, China stands ready to work with India to view and handle the bilateral relationship from a strategic height and a long-term perspective. I'm glad he said strategic height, because satellite definition of the contested border in the Himalayas, if the two sides could agree on satellite definition of the line, that would considerably reduce the friction, the potential conflict between the forces aligned on both sides. And Indian sources have told me it would be very advantageous if, for practical advancement of the relationship, China and India could agree on a satellite-defined, GPS-defined borderline and reduce the scope for friction and conflict as there was back in 2020. And the other line that Chinese have just taken, just yesterday, several days after the summit meeting, is they stress the long-term perspective. And that brings us back to where you asked the question. What's the long term after President Trump goes? Isn't there a long-term fundamental multipolar combination, Russia, India, and China, that would challenge the Trumpian view, which was expressed in the national security document that was issued a couple of days ago also?
Yeah. John, do you think that Russia still tries to somehow mediate between India and China? How do you see in that direction? How important is that? Because as time goes by, you've mentioned the relationship amongst these three important, in my opinion. India is growing to be
Yes.
a superpower. But how is that possible without getting closer to Russia and China? Is that the agenda on the part of Indians to be closer to these two super to Russia? They're pretty close to Russia, but how about China?
Well, Indian opinion is very complicated. It's it's multiplied. It's often expressed. It's a much more openly expressed debating society than one will find in China. And there is reason for suspicion, which the Indians expressed ahead of Putin's visit. Dmitry Peskov, Putin's spokesman, had a briefing session with Indian reporters, and one of them asked explicitly to say, if there's a conflict between India and China in the Himalayas, which way will Russia tilt? And for a very strange reason, Peskov wasn't ready for the question. It's such an obvious question. The Indian expression of this question, and I might say the Chinese expression on the other side, is there, it's current, and it needs Russian answer. Now, Peskov gave a waffly answer that, which I won't bother quoting, because President Putin gave a much better answer in his interview with the Indian reporters, and in his subsequent statements after having a 2.5-hour dinner with Prime Minister Modi at his residence, and then a day of ceremonies and speeches and document signing, agreement signing on last Friday. The Russian side doesn't benefit from China and India fighting or having any form of conflict. The Russian side said when the Himalayan conflict arose in 2020, it said, and I'm just looking down at my paper to what the Galwan Valley conflict of June 2020 triggered on the Russian side. You could sort of say it's diplomatic fatuity. We are watching with great attention what is happening on the Chinese-Indian border. We believe this is very alarming. We consider that the two countries are capable of taking necessary steps to prevent such situations in the future. That's what Dmitry Peskov said back in 2020 when the Galwan Valley fighting occurred and people died, soldiers died. The Russian Foreign Ministry approach was to say, on the surface, we don't take sides. We regret their fighting. We'd like to see it ended. Can the Russian side mediate and effectively bring President Xi closer to Prime Minister Modi and Modi closer to Xi? Well, Putin has done that, and but the ability of the Russian side to mediate depends to a large extent on what Trump does. And what Trump is doing in making hostile moves at both India through Pakistan and through tariff war against India and against China, principally through tariff war against China. What Trump is doing is pushing the three closer together. So while India doesn't need mediation, never did, never will. And that point has been made through the entire Pakistan war of last April, May. That's what angers Indian public opinion and Indian leaders when President Trump claims credit for achieving mediated peace between Pakistan and India. That isn't what happened. We've talked about that before. I know listeners disagree, but the facts on the ground are different. Let's just leave it at that. The the pressures of war pressures on India, the conflict pressures on both India and China that come from the United States, from Trump policy, is having those pressures are having a greater, let's call it, impact on bringing the two, India and China, together than any mediation of a third party. On the other hand, there's goodwill from Russia in both directions. And the simple, long-standing principle each of the three agrees to: we either hang together or we hang separately. And Trump is a hangman.